The previous inquiry leaves behind the tools of comparison and turns instead toward the moment when a monument first becomes visible in the written record, not as an idea, not as a proposal, but as a presence. In the earliest Egyptian textual landscape, the Great Pyramid does not arrive accompanied by explanation. It does not emerge gradually through drafts, corrections, or architectural debate. It appears already there, already named, already situated within a functioning ritual and administrative environment. The record does not ask how it came into being. It proceeds as if the question were unnecessary. The earliest references to the pyramid complex occur in administrative contexts rather than narrative ones. They list offerings delivered, priests assigned, lands allocated, and rituals scheduled. The structure is treated as a fixed coordinate in the state's sacred geography. In these documents, the pyramid is not described as a recent achievement, nor as an extraordinary undertaking. It is a location, a destination, a node within an existing system of exchange and obligation. The language assumes familiarity. There is no sense that the monument requires justification or explanation, only management. This absence becomes more pronounced when set against what Egyptian texts do record in detail. Labor organization for temples, quarry expeditions for later monuments, restoration projects, and ritual renovations are all documented with precision. Scribal hands carefully account for stone moved, grain consumed, and workers assigned. Yet when it comes to the Great Pyramid itself, the archive offers no parallel narrative of planning or execution. The silence is not total, but it is consistent. The scribes do not describe an origin story. They describe a functioning institution. Even royal inscriptions, which often celebrate acts of building, approach the pyramid obliquely. Kings speak of honoring it, restoring casing stones, or associating themselves ritually with its presence. The language frames the monument as something to be entered into, not something to be authored. Authority is expressed through proximity and stewardship, rather than invention. The pyramid is not claimed as a creation so much as a resource of legitimacy, a structure whose existence strengthens the king's position precisely because it stands beyond the scope of ordinary construction. Archaeological evidence reinforces this impression. Excavation around the Giza Plateau reveals layers of activity focused on maintenance, adaptation, and accommodation. Worker settlements show long-term provisioning systems rather than temporary construction camps. Pathways, ramps, and auxiliary buildings appear oriented toward an already determined core. The surrounding infrastructure behaves as if responding to a fixed monumental anchor. There is little indication of experimental phases or abandoned plans. The site looks less like a workshop and more like an administrative district organized around something already resolved. This pattern echoes familiar practices from Mesopotamian contexts, particularly in Sumerian records where temples and city plans are often described as restored rather than founded. Kings, in those texts, present themselves as caretakers of ancient layouts, re-establishing boundaries and measurements believed to originate in a distant, authoritative past. The act of rule is framed as alignment with inherited order. Creation, when mentioned, belongs to an earlier, often undefined time. Administration belongs to the present. The Great Pyramid seems to occupy a similar conceptual space. It is not introduced as a novel solution to a problem, but as a pre-existing fact integrated into a living system. The lack of a developmental narrative may not indicate loss, but for the scribes who recorded its presence, what mattered was not how it was conceived, but how it functioned within an already meaningful landscape. The pyramid's authority may have derived precisely from its perceived antiquity, from the sense that it stood outside the normal cycles of human building. Even the terminology used avoids emphasis on making or shaping. Words associated with enclosure, horizon, and permanence dominate the textual references. The pyramid is linguistically framed as a boundary between realms, a stable interface rather than a constructed object. This suggests a conceptual category, closer to inherited institutions than to recent projects. The monument is treated as something that anchors time, not something located within it. Such treatment does not require the assumption of forgotten builders or lost technologies. It requires only the recognition that societies often distinguish between what they create and what they receive. In Sumerian administrative texts, ancient canals, fields, and temples are managed without recounting their origins. Their authority lies in their endurance. The same logic may apply here. The Great Pyramid enters history not at the moment of its making, but at the moment it becomes administratively relevant. If this is the case, then the question shifts. Instead of asking why the Egyptians did not record the construction of the pyramid, it becomes necessary to ask why they did not feel the need to. What does it mean when a civilization encounters a structure so integrated into its symbolic and bureaucratic order that origin becomes secondary to function? And if the earliest records treat the pyramid as already complete, already authoritative, what kind of past did they believe they were inheriting when they began to write around it? Authority enters the record not as an act of creation, but as a response to something already established. In the earliest formulations of Egyptian kingship, the ruler does not present himself as the originator of order. He appears instead as the one who steps into alignment with it. The language of rule is retrospective. Power is articulated as recognition, assumption, and maintenance, rather than invention. Kingship follows arrival. It does not precede it. Royal titles offer the first indication. The king is not described primarily as a builder or founder, but as a stabilizer of Mohat, a concept treated as pre-existing cosmic balance. Texts do not define Mohat as something the king designs. They describe it as something the king upholds, restores, or protects. This distinction is subtle but consistent. Authority is framed as custodial. The ruler's legitimacy depends on his successful relationship with an inherited structure of order that stands beyond individual reigns. This pattern finds a close parallel in Sumerian, administrative, and royal inscriptions. In those records, kings repeatedly emphasize that they set right ancient temples, returned boundaries to their proper places, or re-established rituals that had fallen into neglect. The language assumes a prior blueprint, even when new construction occurs. It is described as faithful replication of an earlier form, often attributed to a distant, sometimes unnamed past. Innovation is linguistically minimized. Continuity is foregrounded. In both traditions, the moment of accession is telling. Egyptian kingship rituals emphasize coronation as an act of alignment with divine and ancestral order. The king is presented to the gods, not as a challenger, but as a participant. He inherits names, symbols, and responsibilities that already exist. Sumerian kingship follows the same logic. The king receives the me, the fundamental attributes of civilization, which are never described as being invented by humans. They are transferred, guarded, and sometimes lost, but never created anew. Administrative texts reinforce this orientation. Records of taxation, labor, and temple economy rarely connect these systems to the king's personal initiative. They operate as if the king has entered an existing bureaucratic machine. His role is to ensure its smooth functioning. In Sumer, scribes often date documents by regnal years, yet the systems those documents describe show remarkable continuity across reigns. The king changes. The structure persists. When applied to the Great Pyramid, this understanding of kingship becomes significant. If authority is conceptualized as emerging after the arrival of order, then a monument that embodies cosmic and administrative stability does not need to be explained as a royal project. Instead, it becomes a stage upon which kingship is enacted. The pyramid does not require a founder-king narrative, because it already fulfills the function that kingship claims. Anchoring order between realms. This may explain why Egyptian kings so frequently associate themselves with existing monuments, rather than detailing their construction. To claim authorship might diminish the monument's authority by tying it too closely to an individual reign. To claim stewardship preserves its timelessness. Sumerian kings appear to have understood this dynamic well. They rarely boast of originality. Their prestige lies in faithful maintenance of what was handed down. The presence of divine assemblies in both traditions further supports this model. In Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki function as regulators of order rather than active builders in historical time. They assign roles, confirm decisions, and uphold boundaries. Egyptian divine councils operate similarly. The king is their intermediary, not their equal. His authority depends on his capacity to operate within a system that precedes him. Shantis. Why kingship does not inaugurate civilization? It formalizes responsibility for it. The ruler becomes the human interface for an inherited structure whose origins lie beyond recorded history. Monuments, laws, rituals, and measurements all appear as elements of a pre-established order that kings are expected to preserve. Failure to do so is framed as disorder, not as creative deviation. This perspective reframes silence in the record. The absence of detailed construction narratives for the Great Pyramid may reflect not loss, but coherence. If kingship itself is defined as coming after order, then monuments that embody that order would naturally be treated as antecedent realities. They would not be explained because they are explanatory. They justify kingship rather than derive from it. The question, then, is not whether Egyptian kings could have built such a monument, but whether their own language of authority required them to do so. If legitimacy flows from alignment with inherited order, would claiming authorship enhance or undermine that legitimacy? And if kingship, as recorded, consistently follows arrival rather than precedes it, what does that suggest about how the Egyptians understood the origins of the structures that anchored their civilization? If kingship is framed as stewardship rather than authorship, the archive that surrounds it begins to read differently. Administrative texts become records of care, not of conception. This distinction matters when turning to what Egyptian documentation preserves with remarkable consistency and what it does not. The record is dense, where systems require maintenance. It is thin, where origins would be narrated. Nowhere is this imbalance more apparent than in the absence of construction archives for the Great Pyramid. Egyptian scribes were not indifferent to process. On the contrary, they documented labor with careful regularity. Papyrus accounts track work crews, rations, rotations, and seasonal schedules. In other contexts, they describe quarrying expeditions, transportation of stone, and the provisioning of large workforces. Repairs to temples and monuments are recorded in detail, sometimes centuries after original construction. The bureaucracy was capable of preserving technical memory when it was deemed administratively relevant. Yet when attention turns to the Great Pyramid itself, the administrative voice changes. The archive shifts from explanation to assumption. Texts reference personnel assigned to its cult, supplies delivered to its precincts, and rituals conducted in its shadow. They record the upkeep of associated structures and the redistribution of materials taken from its casing in later periods. What they do not record is a sequence of design decisions, calculations, or planning phases that would normally accompany a project of such scale. This absence cannot be easily attributed to chance survival. Comparable documents exist for far smaller undertakings. The construction of modest temples, canals, and storage facilities is often accompanied by records of authorization and execution. In some cases, even failed projects leave traces in the archive. The silence surrounding the pyramid's conception is therefore selective. It suggests a boundary in what was considered appropriate for administrative memory. One possibility is that design logic belonged to a category of knowledge, not routinely archived. But this explanation falters when placed alongside Sumerian parallels. In Mesopotamian contexts, tablets preserve not only administrative transactions, but also metrological tables, architectural ratios, and standardized plans. These texts do not describe specific monuments, but they codify the principles by which construction was understood. They suggest that foundational design knowledge could be treated as a stable inheritance rather than a project-specific innovation. If Egyptian practice followed a similar logic, then the absence of design archives may indicate that the pyramid's underlying principles were not perceived as new or negotiable. They may have been treated as given. The administrative system would then concern itself with execution, maintenance, and ritual integration, not with theoretical exposition. The scribes would record what needed to be managed, not what was assumed to be fixed. This interpretation aligns with the way later Egyptian texts handle restoration. When kings repair ancient monuments, they often emphasize fidelity to an original form whose details are already known. The language implies reference to an authoritative template rather than creative reinterpretation. The act of repair presupposes an enduring design logic that does not need to be it only needs to be respected. The Great Pyramid, in this light, appears less as a construction event than as an administrative constant. Its presence generates records because it requires resources and personnel, not because it requires explanation. The bureaucracy treats it as infrastructure. It is there to be supplied, guarded, and ritually activated. Its logic operates silently beneath these transactions. Sumerian administrative culture offers a useful comparison. There, too, foundational institutions often appear without origin narratives. Canals are listed, fields measured, and temples staffed as if their initial establishment lay beyond the concern of the archive. When origins are mentioned, they are often attributed to divine allocation or primordial time. Human administration begins after that allocation has occurred. The Egyptian archive may reflect a comparable division of temporal responsibility. What belongs to the deep past is acknowledged but not documented. What belongs to ongoing management is recorded in detail. The Great Pyramid sits at the threshold between these categories. It is ancient enough to command reverence, yet active enough to require administration. Its design logic may have been placed firmly in the former category. This does not resolve the question of how the pyramid came to be. It reframes why the question is absent from the record. If the administrative system inherited a monument whose form was already authoritative, then recording its design would serve little bureaucratic purpose. What mattered was how to operate around it, not how to replicate it. As attention moves forward, the issue becomes more precise. If the archive preserves no design logic because that logic was assumed, where else might such assumptions be encoded? If not, in narrative texts or construction accounts, could they reside instead in the measurement systems that quietly structure both monuments and administration and? If so, what do those measurements themselves remember? What the archive leaves unspoken in narrative form often persists in numerical practice. Measurement does not announce itself as history, yet it carries memory with precision. When administrative texts fall silent on design, they continue to speak through units, ratios, and alignments. The Great Pyramid, approached through this lens, reveals not a vocabulary of invention, but a grammar of inheritance. Egyptian measurement systems appear in the record already standardized. The cubit is not introduced as a new solution to a problem. It is used. Surveying practices assume stable proportions. Angles, lengths, and orientations recur with consistency across monuments, landscapes, and administrative texts. The system behaves as if it were already settled before scribes began to record its applications. There is no preserved debate over its calibration, no discussion of alternative schemes. Measurement enters the archive as a given. This treatment mirrors the way Mesopotamian metrology appears in Sumerian tablets. Units of length, area, and volume are presented as fixed references tied to administrative necessity, rather than theoretical exploration. Tables list conversions, not derivations. Ratios are preserved, not explained. The mathematical framework functions as a tool inherited by the scribe, not constructed by him. It belongs to the operation of order, not to its creation. In Egypt, the cubit functions similarly. Its subdivisions are precise, its usage consistent. When applied to monumental architecture, including the Great Pyramid, the resulting proportions align with surveying practices used in fields, canals, and temple precincts. This continuity suggests that monumental scale does not require a separate mathematical language. The same system governs both daily administration and exceptional construction. The difference lies in scale, not in principle. The pyramid's geometry reinforces this impression. Its base dimensions, slopes, and internal relationships conform to ratios that recur elsewhere in Egyptian practice. These ratios do not announce symbolic meaning in the texts. They operate silently, structuring space without commentary. The mathematics is implicit, embedded in action rather than articulated in theory. This is not the behavior of an experimental system. It is the behavior of a mature one. Mesopotamian parallels sharpen the point. Sumerian tablets preserve metrological tables that appear to predate many of the buildings that use them. These tables are copied across generations with minimal variation. They suggest a conception of mathematical order as something received from an earlier authority, sometimes attributed to divine allocation. Human administrators apply the system. They do not redefine it. Measurement becomes a form of obedience. If Egyptian practice followed a comparable logic, then the mathematical framework underlying the Great Pyramid may not have originated with its immediate builders. It may have been inherited as part of a broader system of spatial order. The pyramid would then represent an application of that system at monumental scale, not its point of invention. The absence of explanatory texts would be consistent with this understanding. One does not explain what one is obligated to use. Surveying texts reinforce this continuity. Instructions for land measurement emphasize restoration after disruption, particularly following floods. Boundaries are re-established according to remembered proportions. The The surveyor's task is not to redesign the landscape but to return it to a prior state. Measurement functions as memory. It recalls an ideal arrangement that exists independently of current conditions. This conception resonates with Sumerian administrative language, where surveyors restore fields according to the old measure. The phrase implies a standard that transcends present authority. Kings authorize the act, but they do not define the measure. It precedes them. In both cultures, mathematics serves as a stabilizing inheritance, anchoring administration to an earlier, authoritative order. Applied to the Great Pyramid, this perspective shifts emphasis away from technical ingenuity toward continuity of framework. The pyramid's proportions may reflect a mathematical tradition already embedded in administrative life. Its precision would then be an expression of obedience to inherited ratios, rather than evidence of sudden innovation. The monument would not announce new mathematics, it would confirm existing ones. Such confirmation carries authority. A structure that embodies established measurement reinforces the legitimacy of the system itself. It becomes a reference point, a physical affirmation that the inherited order holds at the largest possible scale. Kings who align themselves with that order. The mathematics does not belong to them, it validates them. This leaves an open implication. If measurement systems function as repositories of inherited knowledge, preserving ratios and proportions across generations without explanation, then they may predate the monuments that exemplify them. And if the Great Pyramid conforms so precisely to such a system, does it reflect the moment that system was applied or the endurance of a framework whose origins lay already beyond the reach of the written record? If measurement preserves inherited order in numerical form, stone preserves it materially. The transition from abstract ratios to physical blocks exposes a further layer of continuity. The Great Pyramid's masonry does not read as a process discovering itself. It reads as execution. The stone behaves as if it already knows where it belongs. Archaeological examination of the pyramid's core reveals patterns that resist interpretation as experimentation. Courses are leveled with consistency across vast distances. Blocks vary in size, yet their placement obeys a coherent internal logic. Adjustments occur, but they do not accumulate into visible learning curves. There is no gradual improvement from crude to refined. Precision is present from the lowest courses upward, not as an achievement reached late, but as a condition assumed early. Trailandera construction typically leaves traces. Incomplete alignments, abandoned techniques, or corrective overlays tend to remain visible in the archaeological record. At Giza, such markers are notably scarce. The masonry does not show hesitation. Even where blocks differ in quality or finish, their integration into the whole remains controlled. The structure absorbs variation without compromising alignment. This suggests not improvisation, but adherence to a stable set of expectations. Logistical evidence supports this reading. The movement and placement of millions of stone blocks required coordination that presupposes familiarity with outcome. Ramps, staging areas, and transport routes appear organized around a predetermined geometry. They respond to the pyramid's form rather than shaping it. This implies that the builders were not discovering the monument as they went. They were servicing a plan already understood. Comparative material from Mesopotamia offers a revealing contrast. In Sumerian contexts, early monumental construction sometimes displays visible transitions in technique. Brick dimensions change. Foundations are reinforced mid-project, and walls are rebuilt when earlier solutions fail. These traces are preserved in excavation layers. They speak of adaptation and learning. Where such learning occurs, the archive often records it indirectly through repair and modification. The Great Pyramid does not exhibit this pattern. Its stonework maintains internal consistency across phases that, in other contexts, would reveal correction. This does not imply perfection, but it does imply confidence. The builders appear to have worked within a framework that constrained acceptable variation. The result is not experimental architecture, but disciplined execution. This discipline extends to material selection. Limestone blocks of varying density are placed strategically. Harder stone supporting areas of greater stress. Granite is reserved for specific internal spaces, integrated with precision that suggests foreknowledge of structural behavior. Such decisions do not read as tests. They read as applications of established practice. Knowledge of stone properties appears operational, not exploratory. In administrative terms, this kind of construction aligns with inherited craft traditions, rather than innovative engineering. Sumerian texts occasionally refer to master builders who know the work of stone and brick, phrasing that emphasizes transmission rather than discovery. Skills are passed down, guarded, and applied. The craft does not belong to the individual builder, it belongs to the system. Egyptian evidence suggests a similar conception. Titles associated with construction emphasize oversight and supervision, not invention. The language points to roles responsible for correct execution, not creative authorship. This reinforces the impression that the work proceeded within established parameters. The stone does not testify to a problem being solved. It testifies to a rule being followed. This perspective reframes the question of logistics. Moving stone at such scale is often presented as the central mystery, yet logistical difficulty does not necessitate conceptual novelty. Large-scale administration is well attested in both Egyptian and Sumerian contexts. What distinguishes the pyramid is not the existence of logistics, but their apparent subordination to a pre-existing form. The machinery of labor serves a design that does not evolve in response to it. Even imperfections support this reading. Minor deviations are corrected locally without altering overall geometry. The structure tolerates adjustment without redesign. This suggests that the builders were not refining an idea, but conforming to one. The margin for error was managed, not explored. The stone records compliance, not inquiry. If experimentation is absent, the question becomes why. One explanation is that the builders possessed complete knowledge from the outset. Another is that they were executing instructions whose authority lay elsewhere. In Sumerian tradition, certain works are undertaken according to the ancient plan, a phrase that places responsibility on fidelity rather than creativity. The Great Pyramid's masonry may reflect a comparable obligation. Stone, unlike text, cannot explain itself. It can only show behavior. At Giza, the behavior of stone suggests certainty without narration. The blocks do not argue with each other. They conform. This conformity implies a shared understanding that precedes placement. If the pyramid's masonry does not behave like a structure discovering its own logic, then where was that logic stored before the first block was set? And if the builders were applying an inherited discipline rather than testing a new one, what institutions carried that discipline forward long enough for stone to remember it? If stone reflects discipline, orientation reflects intention. The masonry of the Great Pyramid settles into place with assurance, but its most striking quality lies not in weight or scale, but in direction. The structure does not merely stand, it faces. Its sides align with the cardinal points with a precision that exceeds what later Egyptian monuments consistently achieve. And yet, like so much else, this precision arrives in the record without explanation. No Egyptian text describes the method by which the pyramid was oriented. There is no preserved account of observation, no ritual manual detailing alignment procedures, no technical discussion of celestial reference points. The orientation is present as a fact, not as a process. The scribes acknowledge the monument's relationship to the horizon and the sky, but they do not narrate how that relationship was established. The precision is treated as normal, not remarkable. Archaeological analysis confirms that the alignment is not approximate. Deviations from true north are minimal, smaller than those found in many later constructions that certainly had access to similar tools. This raises a methodological question. If orientation techniques were known and practiced, why are they not described? And if they were rare or specialized, why is their most exact application left undocumented? Here again, comparison with Sumerian traditions is instructive. In Mesopotamian texts, the sky is not a domain of curiosity, but of order. Astronomical observation is embedded in administrative and ritual life. Celestial movements regulate calendars, festivals, and omens. Yet even there, the origins of sky order are rarely explained. Tablets record correspondences, lists, and cycles, but they do not narrate discovery. Knowledge of the heavens appears as an inherited system, guarded and transmitted, not publicly reasoned. Orientation, in Sumerian architecture, follows this logic. Temples and cities are often aligned according to cardinal or cosmological principles. Yet the texts emphasize correctness rather than method. Builders are praised for setting structures according to heaven and earth, a phrase that signals alignment with an existing cosmic scheme. The scheme itself is not debated. It is ovaith. The Great Pyramid's orientation may reflect a similar conception. Its alignment suggests not experimentation with the sky, but submission to it. The builders appear to have known where north was, not as a matter of approximation, but as a stable reference. The absence of explanation implies that the knowledge was not considered novel. It belonged to a category of understanding that did not require justification. This understanding may have been institutional rather than individual. Orientation could have been the responsibility of specialists whose practices were transmitted through apprenticeship rather than text. In Sumerian contexts, certain astronomical roles are clearly professionalized. The observer does not explain the sky. It reports Italiano. His authority lies in accuracy, not exposition. If a similar structure existed in Egypt, the silence of the archive would be consistent. One does not document what is already entrusted to a specialized order. The pyramid's orientation also resists reduction to symbolic display. While later interpretations often emphasize stellar associations, the structure itself does not announce its celestial logic through inscription. It simply embodies it. The alignment functions quietly, structuring space without commentary. This restraint suggests that the orientation was not meant to be interpreted, but assumed. Such assumption aligns with the broader pattern of inherited order. If the sky was treated as a fixed framework governing time, ritual, and legitimacy, then aligning a monument to it would be an act of compliance rather than creativity. The precision would not require explanation because it would be expected. Failure would be noteworthy. Success would be invisible. The comparison with later Egyptian monuments strengthens this point. Subsequent structures show greater variation in orientation accuracy. This does not indicate loss of skill so much as a shift in emphasis. The Great Pyramid stands apart not because it is alone in seeking alignment, but because it achieves it with an assurance that suggests access to a reference system no longer consistently applied. Sumerian records preserve hints of such systems enduring beyond their initial contexts. Astronomical tables are copied long after their original observational relevance, maintained as authoritative templates. The continued use of these tables does not depend on renewed observation. It depends on trust in inherited calculation. Orientation, once fixed, becomes a matter of replication rather than discovery. If the Great Pyramid belongs to this category, then its alignment may represent the application of a sky order already codified elsewhere in the culture. The builders would not have oriented the monument by reasoning from first principles. They would have followed a procedure whose authority lay in its antiquity. The sky, in this sense, would not be observed anew. It would be recalled. The absence of explanatory texts thus becomes meaningful. Orientation without explanation suggests confidence without narration. The monument does not argue for its place within the cosmos. It assumes Italiano, and the archive, in turn, assumes that assumption. This leaves a quiet uncertainty. If such precise orientation depended on a stable, inherited understanding of the sky, maintained without textual exposition, how was that understanding preserved across generations? And if it later diminished, what does that say about the institutions that once held the sky in place well enough to build by it, without needing to explain how orientation fixes a monument in relation to the sky? Architecture fixes it in relation to society. Once the Great Pyramid stood aligned and complete, other structures began to appear around it. Their placement is revealing. They do not grow out of the pyramid as extensions of a single architectural plan. They gather beside it. The surrounding temples, causeways, and subsidiary buildings behave as if responding to a presence rather than originating alongside it. The earliest cultic structures at Giza show careful accommodation to an already determined core. Causeways align themselves to the pyramid's axis rather than defining one of their own. Mortuary temples attach at specific points, respecting angles and orientations that they did not establish. The architecture suggests deference. These buildings do not reorganize the space. They interpret it. The pyramid functions as a fixed reference, around which ritual activity is arranged. This pattern differs from temple complexes known to have developed organically. In many Egyptian sites, successive phases of construction overwrite earlier layouts, correcting, expanding, or redirecting. Sacred space, walls are shifted, axis adjusted, and orientations refined. At Giza, the pyramid resists such modification. Later builders do not correct it. They work around it. The monumental core remains untouched, while religious life adapts to its immobility. The language of associated inscriptions reinforces this relationship. Texts linked to mortuary temples, emphasize service, offering, and access, rather than foundation. The pyramid is not described as being sanctified by the temples. The temples are sanctified by proximity to the pyramid. Ritual flows toward it, not outward from it. This directional logic suggests that sacred authority is concentrated in the monument itself. Sumerian parallels, again, offer context. In Mesopotamian cities, major temples often occupy ancient sites, believed to have been chosen in primordial time. Later structures cluster around these cores, adding chapels, courtyards, and administrative buildings without altering the original sacred point. Texts describe these centers as places where heaven and earth are joined, language that frames them as fixed nodes of cosmic order. The surrounding architecture exists to serve that node, not to redefine it. At Giza, the spatial hierarchy appears similar. The pyramid is not one element among many, it is the organizing constant. Even when later dynasties add features or repurpose spaces, the central monument remains architecturally aloof. It does not participate in stylistic evil. It does not absorb new symbolic programs. It stands while others interpret it. This relationship becomes clearer when examining later reuse. Stones from the pyramid's casing are removed in subsequent periods, yet the structure's core is left intact. Repairs occur around it, not within Italiano. The act of reuse acknowledges material value without challenging symbolic authority. The pyramid can be drawn from materially while remaining untouchable conceptually. Such selectivity implies reverence rooted in perceived antiquity. Administrative records mirror this separation. Cultic personnel are assigned to the pyramid precinct. Offerings are allocated and rituals scheduled, but the monument itself remains administratively passive. It receives attention. It does not generate instructions. The bureaucracy treats it as an endpoint rather than a process. This differs from temples whose operations evolve over time, reflected in changing administrative language. The pyramid's role remains stable. The architectural dialogue between pyramid and temple thus suggests a sequence. The monument first, the cult later. Religious spaces do not appear to commemorate construction. They appear to manage presence. The builders of temples act as interpreters of a legacy they did not author. Their architecture speaks in response to something already meaningful. Such behavior aligns with an understanding of civilization as layered memory. In Sumerian contexts, ancient sacred sites are often described as having been established in the first days, long before current kings. Later, rulers build beside these places, not to claim origin, but to demonstrate continuity. Their legitimacy derives from correct placement, not creative assertion. The Great Pyramids surrounding architecture may reflect the same logic. The temples do not explain the monument. They accept Italiano. They frame it ritually, administratively, and spatially, reinforcing its authority without redefining it. The result is a landscape organized around inheritance rather than innovation. This raises a final, quiet implication. If religious architecture adapts itself to a monument it does not conceptually control, then the monument occupies a different temporal category than the structures built to serve it. It belongs to an earlier layer of meaning, one that later builders recognize, but do not revisit. And if temples were built beside the pyramid because its significance was already settled, what kind of past were they responding to when they chose to worship in its shadow rather than remake it? As the architectural landscape settles into ritual use, the textual landscape begins to speak, not about beginnings, but about purpose. The pyramid texts enter the record as functional language, activated within a completed world. They do not tell how the monument came to be, they tell how it is to be used. These texts are among the earliest substantial corpora of Egyptian religious writing, yet their focus is narrow and disciplined. They speak to transition, ascent, protection, and continuity. The pyramid is treated as an operative environment, a structured space through which the king moves in death. The language assumes the monument's form and efficacy. It does not pause to justify either. The texts are instructions for use, not explanations of origin. This distinction is consistent throughout later inscriptions as well. Reliefs, offering formulas, and ritual notations refer to the pyramid as a locus of action. The monument functions as a gateway, a stabilizing axis, a place where procedures occur. Words activate space. They do not explain its genesis. The scribes write as if the pyramid's existence requires no narrative framing. It is already fully integrated into the conceptual order the texts inhabit. Such integration suggests that, for the authors of these texts, the pyramid's origin lay outside the domain of ritual language. Ritual speech concerns itself with what must be done now, according to established patterns. It presupposes a world already structured. In Sumerian ritual texts, a similar pattern appears. Incantations and temple hymns describe how spaces function within cosmic order, not how they were first established. Origins, when mentioned at all, are assigned to primordial time or divine action beyond human record. The pyramid texts operate within this same temporal division. They address a king who is entering an inherited pathway. The language instructs him how to ascend, whom to address, and what transformations to undergo. The monument is treated as a known quantity. Its pathway is already validated by precedent. There is no suggestion that the texts are inaugurating a new use. They formalize an existing one. This formalization is significant. It implies that ritual knowledge follows architecture, not the reverse. The pyramid exists as a structured space before the texts articulate its function. The texts then stabilize that function, ensuring continuity across reigns. This sequence aligns with an understanding of civilization as layered practice. Structures first, procedures second, explanations rarely. Later inscriptions maintain this orientation. When kings reference pyramids or ancient monuments, they speak of honoring, restoring, or renewing ritual use. They do not recount construction. Even when new pyramids are built, the textual emphasis remains on ritual efficacy rather than architectural novelty. The language does not differentiate sharply between older and newer monuments in terms of origin. It differentiates them in terms of function. This functional focus parallels Sumerian administrative language, where temples are described by what they do rather than how they were made. Offerings are listed, festivals scheduled, and personnel assigned. The temple's origin lies in the distant past, sometimes attributed to divine establishment. The archive concerns itself with continuity of operation. Explanation yields to repetition. In the Egyptian case, the silence around construction becomes especially striking given the density of ritual description. The texts are not sparse. They are precise, formulaic, and attentive to detail. If construction history were relevant to ritual efficacy, it might be expected to appear. Its absence suggests that origin was not ritually significant. What mattered was alignment with an established order, not the narrative of how that order came into human hands. This perspective reframes the role of writing itself. Texts do not function as repositories of total knowledge. They preserve what must be remembered for continuity. In both Sumerian and Egyptian traditions, writing stabilizes practice rather than commemorates innovation. The pyramid texts stabilize the pyramid's role within the cosmic system. They do not historicize it. The language also avoids personal attribution. The king speaks through formulas that place him within a lineage of predecessors. His individuality dissolves into function. He becomes the latest participant in a process already underway. The pyramid facilitates this transformation precisely because it stands outside individual biography. Its authority does not derive from a named builder. It derives from its assumed permanence. This raises a subtle implication. If ritual texts treat the pyramid as an inherited environment whose origin is irrelevant to its function, then the monument occupies a category closer to natural features than to human projects. It is not explained because it is not questioned. Its presence is axiomatic. Such axioms often conceal histories too old, too authoritative, or too conceptually distant to narrate. In Sumerian thought, the deepest foundations of order belong to the time before kingship, before cities, before writing. Human texts begin after arrival. They manage what has been received. The pyramid texts may reflect a similar threshold. They speak from within a world where the pyramid already belongs. They do not look back to a moment of making. They look forward to continuity of use. If the earliest ritual language treats the pyramid as a functional constant rather than a historical event, then the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of origin becomes invisible when a structure is absorbed so completely into the grammar of ritual that its beginning no longer matters, and how far back must that beginning lie for silence to feel, not like omission, but like order? Ritual language assumes function. Administrative language assumes continuity. When the Great Pyramid re-enters the record through acts of repair, the same pattern holds. The texts do not return to beginnings. They remain focused on upkeep. What is remembered is not how the monument was made, but how it is to be maintained. Evidence for repair and material reuse appears across periods. Casing stones are removed and repurposed. Mortuary temples are restored. Causeways are cleared, foundations reinforced, access re-established. These actions are not hidden. They are recorded, authorized, sometimes even celebrated. Kings speak openly of renewing what has fallen into disrepair, yet the language avoids origin. Restoration does not trigger retrospection. It reinforces inheritance. This emphasis is not accidental. Egyptian administrative texts are precise when it comes to responsibility. They name officials, allocate resources, and define obligations. When repairs are undertaken, the archive records the act as fulfillment of duty. The monument is treated as something that must be preserved because it already holds authority. The reason for that authority is not restated. Assumed. The removal of casing stones is particularly revealing. Later periods draw material from the pyramid without challenging its conceptual status. Stone can be taken, meaning cannot. The core remains intact while its surface is altered. This selective intervention suggests a hierarchy between material and form. What matters is not the original finish, but the enduring structure. The pyramid's essence survives even when parts are stripped away. Sumerian parallels illuminate this logic. In Mesopotamian texts, ancient temples are frequently repaired, rebuilt, or even dismantled and reassembled. Kings record these actions as acts of piety and responsibility. They emphasize fidelity to the original plan, even when using new materials. The authority of the temple lies not in its current fabric, but in its sanctioned form. Restoration renews legitimacy by acknowledging antiquity. In both traditions, repair narratives function as affirmations of continuity. They place the king in a lineage of caretakers. The act of maintenance signals alignment with an inherited order. Creation, by contrast, would shift focus to individual initiative. Repair keeps attention on the monument's prior claim to authority. The absence of construction narratives becomes more striking in this context. If origin were central to legitimacy, it would resurface during restoration. Kings would remind audiences of foundational moments to justify intervention. Instead, they speak as if the monument's authority is self-evident. Repair does not require historical explanation. It requires acknowledgement of responsibility. Archaeologically, this attitude is mirrored in the way repairs are executed. Later modifications respect the pyramid's geometry. Even when stones are removed, the underlying form is preserved. There is no attempt to redesign, improve, or reinterpret the structure. The goal is stability, not enhancement. This restraint implies recognition of a boundary. The monument is not open to creative revision. Administrative practice reinforces this boundary. Records treat the pyramid as an asset requiring protection. Guards are assigned, offerings managed, access regulated. These measures persist across dynastic changes. The bureaucracy adapts around the monument rather than redefining it. The pyramid remains administratively conservative even as regimes shift. Such conservatism aligns with an understanding of civilization as custodial. In Sumerian thought, kingship often emerges in response to disorder. The king restores canals, reestablishes temples, and reasserts measures. His role is corrective, not inventive. Egyptian repair narratives fit this pattern. The king intervenes to prevent decay, not to reimagine structure. This focus on maintenance also affects how time is perceived. Repair narratives collapse, distance between past and present. The monument is not ancient in a historical sense. It is ongoing. Its relevance is continuous. By emphasizing care over creation, the texts keep the pyramid within living time, while keeping its origin beyond narrative reach. The problem, then, is not that construction records are missing. It is that maintenance records function perfectly well without them. The administrative system does not require an origin story to justify action. It requires recognition of obligation. The pyramid commands that obligation by virtue of its assumed permanence. This dynamic suggests that the monument's authority predates the archival moment. Repair acknowledges that authority rather than explains it. The archive begins after arrival, at the point where care becomes necessary. What lies before that point remains unspoken. If records repeatedly emphasize maintenance while leaving creation untouched, this may indicate not forgetfulness, but structure. Some things are made and then remembered. Others are remembered without ever being described as made. And if the Great Pyramid belongs to the latter category, what does that imply about the kind of past that could command care across centuries without ever needing to be recalled as an act of human making? Maintenance presumes something older than the caretaker. To understand how such a presumption could operate without strain, it becomes necessary to step outside Egypt and examine a culture where the logic of inherited order is stated with unusual clarity. In the administrative and royal tablets of southern Mesopotamia, kingship is not introduced as an act of founding. It is framed as an acceptance of responsibility for systems that already exist. Sumerian records consistently describe the world as structured before the king's arrival. Canals are measured, fields allocated, temples staffed, and laws enforced according to standards that are treated as prior. The king does not define these standards. He aligns himself with them. In royal inscriptions, legitimacy is expressed through verbs of restoration and protection. Kings speak of returning temples to their proper condition, re-establishing boundaries, and maintaining the correct sequence of rites. The language presupposes a normative order whose origin lies beyond the reign. This presupposition is formalized in the concept of the me. These are not laws or tools, but attributes of civilization itself: kingship, truth, craft, measurement, and ritual. Sumerian texts describe them as existing independently of human invention. They are distributed, guarded, lost, and recovered, but never created by kings. Human authority depends on correct possession and administration of these elements. The king's role is custodial. He manages inheritance rather than initiating change. Administrative tablets reinforce this conception. Land surveys, labor assignments, and ration lists operate with stable terminology across generations. Even when political power shifts, the bureaucratic language remains strikingly consistent. The archive behaves as if it were anchored to an older template. Change is registered as disruption, not innovation. Restoration returns the system to its expected state. In this context, construction is rarely presented as a creative act. When temples are built or rebuilt, inscriptions emphasize fidelity to an ancient plan. Builders claim to follow measurements established in former days. The authority of the structure derives from its alignment with that remembered form. New materials or techniques are acceptable only insofar as they reproduce the inherited pattern. The past functions as a standard, not a story. This understanding of authority extends to divine involvement. The Anunnaki and Sumerian texts do not appear as active builders within historical time. They function as guarantors of order. They assign domains, confirm decisions, and uphold cosmic balance. Their presence legitimizes systems rather than explains their physical origin. Human rulers mediate between this divine order and administrative reality. Their success is measured by continuity, not by novelty. When this framework is set alongside Egyptian practice, the similarities are instructive. Egyptian kingship language also emphasizes maintenance of balance, alignment with cosmic order, and stewardship of sacred spaces. The absence of construction narratives for the Great Pyramid begins to resemble a broader cultural logic rather than an anomaly. In a system where authority flows from inheritance, origins recede into a conceptual background that need not be narrated. Sumerian tablets make this logic explicit. They record moments when order falters: floods, invasions, neglect, and the king responds by restoring what should have been. The ideal state is not progressive. It is stable. Civilization is something that must be kept in place. Writing serves this goal by preserving procedures, not by celebrating invention. This perspective also clarifies the relationship between monument and ruler. In Sumer, temples are older than kings. The ruler's legitimacy depends on correct interaction with these ancient institutions. He does not explain their beginnings. He demonstrates his worth by maintaining them. The monument, in turn, stands as a witness to an order that transcends individual reigns. Applied comparatively, the Great Pyramid begins to resemble a monument operating under the same logic. Its authority may not derive from a remembered act of construction, but from its role as a stabilizing element within a broader inherited system. Kings associate themselves with it as caretakers, not as originators. Repair, ritual, and administration become the appropriate modes of engagement. This does not require assuming direct transmission between cultures. It requires recognizing a shared administrative philosophy, that civilization is received before it is managed. In both contexts, writing enters after arrival. The archive documents alignment, not genesis. What is oldest is treated as most authoritative, and therefore least in need of explanation. Such a philosophy produces a distinctive silence. Origins are not denied. They are displaced into a realm beyond human narration. The king does not ask where order came from. He asks how to keep it intact. The scribe does not record the moment of creation. He records compliance. If the Great Pyramid was integrated into Egyptian civilization in a manner comparable to how ancient temples functioned in Sumerian thought, then its silence in the archive may reflect the same principle. It belongs to a category of things that confer legitimacy precisely because they preceded. They are not remembered as events, but as conditions. The comparative question that remains is therefore quiet but consequential. If both cultures articulate authority as stewardship of an inherited order, what kinds of monuments and systems would naturally fall outside historical narration? How might such inherited structures shape civilization long after their origins have slipped beyond the reach of writing? Inherited order, once established, requires more than maintenance. It requires legitimacy that does not depend on individual rulers or even on human memory alone. In Sumerian records, this legitimizing function is often carried by figures who do not build, command, or innovate in the human sense. They authorize. The Anunnaki appear within the archive, not as engineers of civilization, but as its administrative memory. References to the Anunnaki are sparse and carefully positioned. They do not populate narratives of construction or technological achievement. Instead, they appear in contexts where order must be affirmed, in lists of divine assemblies, in legal formulas, in hymns that establish jurisdiction over land, city, or ritual domain. Their role is not productive. It is confirmatory. They stand behind systems already in operation, anchoring them beyond the reach of human revision. This positioning is consistent across textual genres. In administrative language, the Anunnaki are invoked when decisions require sanction rather than explanation. Their presence signals that a boundary has been crossed from human discretion into inherited structure. The text does not describe what they do. It assumes what they represent. Their authority is not exercised through action, but through acknowledgement. Such figures function as stabilizers of memory. They hold in place what cannot be renegotiated. In Sumerian thought, laws, measurements, and roles exist because they were allocated in an authoritative past. The Anunnaki are associated with that allocation. They do not continuously intervene. They guarantee that the system remains what it is supposed to be. Their power lies in continuity, not intervention. This conception reframes how divine presence operates within administrative culture. The gods are not solutions to technical problems. They are custodians of legitimacy. When a law is enforced, it is not because it is newly reasoned, but because it aligns with an order recognized by the divine assembly. When a measurement is applied, it is correct not because it was calculated, but because it conforms to what was assigned. The absence of building narratives associated with the Anunnaki is therefore significant. If they functioned as creators in historical time, one would expect records of their acts. Instead, the texts preserve their role as witnesses and guarantors. They confirm rather than construct. Civilization unfolds beneath them, not through them. This understanding clarifies how inherited systems persist without constant justification. When authority is anchored to figures beyond human time, administrative practice can proceed without revisiting origins. The Anunnaki absorb the burden of explanation. Their invocation allows the archive to remain focused on operation rather than genesis. The system works because it is sanctioned, not because it is explained. In Egyptian contexts, a similar function appears under different names and forms. Divine councils confirm kingship, maintain cosmic balance, and uphold order. They are not described as builders of monuments within historical narrative. They legitimize structures that already exist. The king acts as mediator, ensuring alignment between human administration and inherited order. Shamti's Y references to divine assemblies do not introduce myth into the record. They introduce memory. They preserve the idea that certain systems predate human authority. Writing does not attempt to historicize these origins. It uses divine reference to mark their immovability. What is divinely sanctioned is not open to redesign. Applied to the Great Pyramid, this framework offers a subtle interpretive shift. If Egyptian civilization inherited a monumental structure whose authority needed no human explanation, divine reference would function not to explain its construction, but to affirm its place within cosmic order. The monument would not need a builder narrative if its legitimacy was already secured at a higher level of memory. In Sumerian practice, the Anunnaki occupy precisely this role. They are invoked when boundaries must not be crossed, when measures must not be altered, when law must remain law. Their presence in the text marks the transition from human choice to inherited necessity. They are administrative memory per se. This does not require belief in their physical activity. It requires recognition of their textual function. They stand at the point where explanation ends and obligation begins. The scribe does not elaborate on them because elaboration would weaken their authority. Silence preserves their role. If inherited systems require figures who stabilize memory beyond human record, then monuments embedded within those systems may share the same protection. They become unquestioned anchors, not because their origins are unknown, but because their origins are irrelevant to their function. Authority flows downward, not backward. The Anunnaki, then, do not explain how civilization was built. They explain why it must be maintained. Their appearance in the archive allows the past to remain authoritative without being near. They ensure that order feels older than any king who enforces it. This leads to an inevitable but restrained question. If divine figures function as administrative memory-preserving systems whose origins lie beyond writing, then when a monument stands fully integrated into such a system, does it belong to human history at all, or to the inherited order that history itself was written to serve? Administrative memory presumes continuity, yet continuity is most clearly tested at moments of rupture. In Mesopotamian records, such rupture is named. Flood traditions recur across Sumerian and Akkadian texts, not as metaphor, but as a boundary in time. The world before the flood and the world after it are treated as distinct administrative conditions. What survives the flood does so by inheritance, not by reconstruction. This framing offers a revealing contrast to Egyptian silence. In Sumerian tradition, the flood is not merely a disaster, it is a reset. Kingship is described as descending again after the waters recede. Cities are temples are restored. Lists of rulers are divided cleanly at this event. The narrative does not dwell on engineering or survival strategies. It dwells on legitimacy. Authority after the flood is valid because it reconnects with what existed before. Civilization resumes by recalling an earlier order. This logic is visible in the way Sumerian texts handle material remnants. Post-flood kings restore ancient sanctuaries whose foundations are said to predate catastrophe. Measurements are returned according to former standards. Laws are reasserted as continuations, not innovations. The flood does not erase order. It interrupts access to it. Recovery is framed as inheritance from a deeper past that survived conceptually even if materially disrupted. The flood narrative thus performs an administrative function. It explains why certain institutions feel older than the current political order. It justifies the authority of structures that appear without origin stories. If something is said to come from before the flood, it lies beyond ordinary historical accounting. Its legitimacy does not require documentation. It requires recognition. Egyptian records present a strikingly different posture. There is no equivalent narrative of total catastrophe dividing time. Flooding is present, but it is cyclical and managed. The Nile inundation renews, rather than destroys. There is no textual moment where civilization is reset. Kingship flows without interruption. Monuments stand across dynasties without being framed as survivals from a lost world. This absence is not a lack of memory. It is a different strategy of explanation, where Mesopotamian texts account for inherited remnants by naming catastrophe. Egyptian texts allow inheritance to stand without justification. Continuity is assumed, not defended. Structures that appear ancient are not explained as survivals. They are treated as part of the normal order of things. This difference has implications for how monuments are understood. In a culture with a reset myth, inherited structures require narrative framing. They must be placed on the far side of catastrophe to preserve their authority. In a culture without such a myth, inheritance can be quieter. Ancient structures need not be explained as survivors. They simply persist. Archaeologically, both regions show evidence of disruption. Flood layers exist in Mesopotamian sites. Periods of abandonment and rebuilding are documented. Egyptian sites also show change, repair, and reuse. Yet only one tradition elevates catastrophe to a defining narrative boundary. The other absorbs disruption into a continuous administrative rhythm. This contrast affects how silence is interpreted. In Sumerian texts, silence about origins is often filled by the flood. What cannot be explained historically is placed before the reset. In Egyptian texts, silence remains silence. There is no need to push origins into a mythic past because continuity itself provides legitimacy. For the Great Pyramid, this difference is significant. If Egyptian culture did not employ a reset narrative to explain inherited remnants, then a monument appearing without origin does not demand mythic justification. It can simply be there. Its authority derives from uninterrupted presence rather than survival from catastrophe. The absence of a flood myth allows the absence of an origin story. In Mesopotamia, inherited order must be reconnected after disruption. In Egypt, inherited order appears never to have been broken. This does not mean catastrophe did not occur. It means it was not used as an explanatory device. The administrative system continues as if order endured beneath surface change. Sumerian flood traditions thus illuminate a function rather than a belief. They explain how civilization can resume without recreation. Egyptian silence achieves the same end by different means. Both allow ancient systems to persist without documentation of origin. One names the break, the other refuses to acknowledge it. When placed side by side, these approaches suggest that cultures develop narrative tools to manage the problem of inheritance. When disruption is named, inheritance is justified by survival. When disruption is unnamed, inheritance is justified by continuity. In both cases, monuments that appear older than the record remain authoritative because they are not required to explain themselves. This returns the inquiry to the monument at the center of this investigation. If the Great Pyramid belongs to a tradition that did not narrate catastrophe as reset, then its silence may not conceal loss, but reflect confidence. It stands not as a survivor of a destroyed world, but as an element of an order that was never publicly broken. The unresolved question is, therefore, not whether catastrophe occurred, but how it was remembered. If some cultures explain inheritance by naming rupture and others by maintaining silence, then what? Does the presence of an unexplained monument tell us about the kind of past a civilization chose to acknowledge and what kinds of disruption it chose not to record at all? Silence around origins is not unique to Egypt or Mesopotamia. When viewed more broadly, it appears as a recurring structural feature in how early civilizations relate to certain monuments. These structures entered the record already complete, already authoritative, and already embedded within social and ritual systems. The resemblance lies not in form, technique, or symbolism, but in the way explanation recedes while function remains. In several ancient contexts, monumental architecture appears without a corresponding narrative of experimentation or development. The earliest textual references do not describe planning debates, failed attempts, or gradual refinement. They assume presence. Administration begins after arrival. Ritual adapts to what stands. The monument is treated as an inherited condition rather than a recent accomplishment. This pattern does not require contact or shared knowledge. It reflects a similar administrative posture toward authority. Where monuments are perceived as anchoring order, their origins become secondary. What matters is correct use, maintenance, and alignment. The archive documents these responsibilities with precision while leaving beginnings unaddressed. Archaeologically, such monuments often show high internal coherence from their earliest phases. They do not display obvious learning curves. Surrounding structures suggest themselves around a fixed core. Later modifications respect the original geometry even when materials or techniques change. The monument resists integration into a narrative of progress. It stands apart, temporally and conceptually. Texts associated with these structures reinforce the pattern. Ritual language focuses on access, movement, and activation rather than construction. Inscriptions speak of honoring, restoring, or approaching the monument. They do not recount how it was conceived. The silence is systematic. It suggests that origin did not belong to the category of knowledge meant to be preserved. This does not imply that builders lacked skill or understanding. It implies that their understanding operated within a framework already regarded as authoritative. The act of building becomes an execution of obligation rather than an act of invention. Knowledge is applied, not debated. Precision is expected, not celebrated. In administrative cultures, this approach serves stability. When authority is grounded in inheritance, change becomes risky. Explaining origins might invite reinterpretation. Silence protects continuity. By not narrating beginnings, the system avoids opening them to question. The monument's authority remains intact because it is not anchored to a moment that could be re-examined. Comparative evidence suggests that this strategy appears wherever monuments function as guarantors of order rather than expressions of identity. They are not commemorative. They are regulatory. Their role is to stabilize relationships between land, ritual, and authority. Once they fulfill that role, their origin ceases to matter administratively. This structural similarity cautions against diffusionist conclusions. Shared silence does not require shared contact. It requires shared administrative needs. Different cultures confronting the problem of legitimacy may arrive at similar solutions. Treat certain structures as given, embed them into ritual and bureaucracy, and refrain from historicizing their beginnings. Such restraint also shapes memory. What is not written becomes immovable. The monument's past is not forgotten. It is sealed. Writing begins after it. The archive grows around it. Over time, the structure acquires a depth that feels primordial, regardless of its actual age. Its authority increases precisely because it escapes narration. Shanties, why the Great Pyramid, belongs to a wider category of monuments that operate as fixed points in cultural landscapes. They are less objects of history than conditions of it. They allow societies to orient themselves, without needing to explain how orientation first occurred. The value of these parallels lies not in proving connection, but in clarifying possibility. They show that civilizations can and do treat certain achievements as inherited realities, even when they were once constructed by human hands. The decision not to narrate origin is itself a cultural act, one that preserves authority by withholding explanation. This raises a final, quiet implication. If multiple civilizations chose to integrate certain monuments into their worlds without recording how they came into being, then the absence of origin stories may reflect not loss or mystery, but intent. And if silence can function as a tool of preservation, what kinds of structures are most likely to be protected by Yatanda? What does that suggest about the monuments that history allows us to question, versus those it teaches us simply to accept? Silence around origins is sustained only if knowledge itself is controlled. What survives across generations does so not because it is widely explained, but because it is carefully preserved. In both Egyptian and Sumerian contexts, technical knowledge appears in the record not as instruction meant for expansion, but as tradition meant for continuity. It is present, precise, and restrained. Educational texts do exist. Scribes are trained, formulas copied, tables memorized. Yet these materials reveal a striking pattern. They teach how to apply systems, not how those systems came into being. Mathematical exercises demonstrate correct procedure, not conceptual foundation. Architectural proportions are implied through repetition, not derived through explanation. Knowledge is transmitted as correct usage, not as open reasoning. In Egypt, this approach is visible in the training of scribes and surveyors. Exercises emphasize replication of established forms. The student learns to measure fields, calculate volumes, and copy administrative language with accuracy. There is little encouragement to question underlying principles. Mastery is demonstrated through conformity. The goal is reliability, not innovation. Sumerian scribal culture follows the same pattern. Lexical lists, metrological tables, and numerical sequences are copied across centuries with minimal variation. These texts do not argue for their correctness. They assume Italiano. The act of copying becomes an act of preservation. Knowledge is stabilized through repetition rather than elaboration. This mode of transmission suggests that technical understanding was treated as inherited property. It belonged to institutions, not individuals. Access was mediated through training, not publication. The archive reflects this structure. What is written down is what must remain consistent. What is left unwritten may be equally important, but it is protected through practice rather than text. Such protection creates boundaries. Certain skills appear fully formed when they enter the record. They do not emerge gradually through trial and discussion. They are applied with confidence. When errors occur, they are corrected locally, without re-examining the system itself. This indicates a hierarchy of knowledge. Application is flexible. Framework is not. In this context, the absence of explicit technical instruction for monumental construction becomes less surprising. If architectural and surveying knowledge was embedded in professional lineages, then writing it down in explanatory form might have been unnecessary or even undesirable. The written archive would preserve outcomes and obligations, while the methods remained within controlled channels of transmission. This dynamic is visible in how mistakes are handled. In both cultures, errors are treated as deviations from an expected standard, not as opportunities for revision. The correct form is known. It does not need to be redefined. This attitude reinforces the sense that technical systems were regarded as complete, not provisional. Applied to monumental architecture, this suggests that builders were executing knowledge that was already stabilized. The Great Pyramid's precision would then reflect not extraordinary innovation, but disciplined adherence to inherited technique. The absence of instructional texts would be consistent with a culture that valued guarded transmission over open dissemination. Sumerian parallels strengthen this interpretation. Certain crafts are described as ancient, their origins attributed to divine allocation. Human practitioners inherit responsibility for correct execution, not for conceptual development. The craft is older than the craftsman. His role is to maintain its integrity. Egyptian evidence points in the same direction. Titles associated with technical roles emphasize oversight and correctness. The language does not celebrate invention. It emphasizes trust. The individual is a carrier of tradition, not its source. Knowledge persists because it is conserved, not because it is taught in full. This model of preservation has consequences for how civilization evolves. Change occurs slowly, often through accumulation of practice rather than formal innovation. When systems work, they are left untouched. When T-file, they are restored. The archive records stability as an achievement in itself. Such an environment would naturally produce monuments that appear suddenly complete. The knowledge required to create them would not be developed publicly. It would already exist within professional and institutional memory. Writing would capture the monument's role, not the process that produced it. This does not imply secrecy in a modern sense. It implies prioritization. What must be remembered for continuity is written. What must be protected for stability is practiced. The result is a civilization where knowledge feels ancient because it is never presented as new. If technical understanding was preserved rather than taught openly, then monuments like the Great Pyramid become expressions of continuity rather than moments of breakthrough. They embody systems whose origins lie beyond textual explanation because those origins were never meant to be part of the record. The question that follows is quiet but persistent. If knowledge survives by being guarded within practice rather than explained in text, then how? Much of what shaped early civilization remains invisible to us, not because it was lost, but because it was never meant to be taught beyond those already entrusted with carrying it forward. Preservation depends not only on what is written, but on what is left unsaid. After examining texts, stones, measurements, and traditions, the absence itself begins to form a pattern. Egyptian records do not merely fail to explain certain things. They consistently avoid explaining them. This avoidance is structured, repeated, and stable across genres. Silence, in this context, behaves less like loss and more like language. The archive speaks freely about administration. It records offerings, personnel, rituals, repairs, boundaries, and duties with meticulous care. It speaks about kingship, succession, and alignment with order. It speaks about correct performance. What it does not speak about are beginnings that would destabilize authority if they were open to discussion. The construction logic of foundational monuments belongs to this category. This pattern suggests that omission was not accidental. It reflects an understanding of what writing was for. Egyptian texts do not aim to explain the world from first principles. They aim to maintain it. Writing enters after structure. It stabilizes what already exists. Anything that predates that stability remains outside the archive's mandate. Silence becomes most visible when compared to what could have been written. Egyptian scribes were capable of describing complex processes. They documented quarry expeditions, labor organization, and material logistics for later projects. They describe repairs with precision. The absence of equivalent descriptions for the Great Pyramid is therefore selective. It marks a boundary in narratable knowledge. That boundary appears wherever explanation would threaten permanence. To describe how something was made is to admit that it could have been made differently. To narrate origin is to anchor authority in a moment that could be questioned. By refusing to explain certain structures, the archive protects them from reinterpretation. Their authority remains fixed because it is not historicized. This logic is consistent with inherited order. Systems that derive legitimacy from antiquity must feel older than memory. Writing, which organizes memory, cannot reach them without diminishing their status. Silence preserves distance. It places origins beyond the administrative horizon, where they remain unquestionable. The language of Egyptian texts reinforces this distance. Verbs cluster around maintenance rather than creation. Terms associated with restoration appear where one might expect foundation. The king does not bring order into being. He keeps it from slipping. This choice of language narrows the scope of narrative time. History begins after arrival. Such narrowing is not unique. Sumerian archives display similar restraint. Certain institutions are treated as given. Their beginnings are attributed to a primordial allocation that writing does not attempt to describe. Egyptian silence operates without that mythic framing, but the effect is similar. What lies before writing remains authoritative precisely because it is unreachable. This does not mean the Egyptians lacked curiosity about origins. It means that origins were not administratively useful. Writing served the needs of continuity, not speculation. The archive was not a space for inquiry. It was a tool for regulation. Silence protected that function. When viewed this way, omission becomes data, the repeated absence of origin narratives. For the Great Pyramid, for measurement systems, for alignment procedures, and for foundational authority suggests intentional restraint. These elements belong to a layer of reality that writing was not meant to expose. They were inherited conditions, not topics. The effect of this restraint is cumulative. Over time, what is never explained acquires an aura of inevitability. The monument does not need a story. It is the story's foundation. The archive grows around it, reinforcing its presence without questioning its past. This perspective reframes modern frustration with missing explanations. What appears to us as a gap may have functioned as a safeguard. Silence maintained hierarchy between what could be managed and what could not be altered. The most authoritative structures remain the least narrative. If silence is treated as a form of communication, then it conveys a clear message. Certain things were not open to discourse. Their origins lay outside the scope of human administration. Writing begins only after their arrival. The unresolved implication is therefore subtle. If Egyptian texts consistently avoid explaining what anchors their civilization most firmly, then the silence itself becomes a clue to how they understood authority. And if the most powerful structures are those that writing refuses to touch, what does that suggest about the kind of past that must remain silent in order for the present to remain stable? Beyond this point, the inquiry no longer rests on any single strand of evidence. It unfolds across records, measurements, materials, language, and silence itself. The question is no longer whether the Great Pyramid could have been built by the Egyptians, but how it was positioned within their own understanding of civilization. Across disciplines, a consistent orientation emerges. The pyramid behaves not as an invention that demanded explanation, but as an inheritance that required management. From an administrative perspective, the monument enters the record already operational. It generates obligations, assignments, and rituals, without ever generating a narrative of origin. The archive responds to its presence rather than accounting for its creation. This response is not passive. It is structured. The pyramid is administered, supplied, guarded, restored, and ritually activated. These actions imply responsibility, not authorship. Civilization organizes itself around the monument as though it were a fixed point. Architecturally, the surrounding landscape reinforces this interpretation. Temples, causeways, and precincts adapt themselves to the pyramid's orientation and position. They do not correct it, refine it, or reinterpret it. De y accept. Italiano. The monument sets the terms of engagement. Later architecture behaves as commentary rather than composition. This hierarchy suggests that the pyramid occupies a different temporal category than the buildings that serve it. Material analysis echoes the same pattern. The masonry does not record experimentation. Precision appears early and remains stable. Logistics serve a predetermined form. Adjustments occur, but they are local and corrective, not exploratory. The stone behaves as if guided by rules already known. It does not reveal a structure discovering its own logic. It reveals a system executing one. Measurement systems deepen the impression. Cubits, ratios, and surveying practices appear standardized before they are explained. They function consistently across domains, from fields to monuments. Mathematical order does not announce itself as innovation. It operates silently, embedded in practice. The pyramid's proportions align with this inherited framework, suggesting application rather than invention. Orientation adds another layer. The monument's cardinal alignment is precise, beyond what later periods consistently achieve. Yet no textual explanation accompanies it. The sky order appears assumed. Alignment is not celebrated. It is expected. This expectation implies a reference system treated as authoritative, not experimental. The pyramid faces the world as if the world's order were already known. Texts further clarify the monument's role. Ritual inscriptions describe function without origin. They instruct kings how to move through the pyramid's space, not how that space was conceived. Writing begins after the structure's authority is established. The pyramid is treated as an environment, not an event. Language activates it but does not historicize it. Repair narratives reinforce the same orientation. When intervention occurs, it is framed as maintenance. Kings restore, renew, and protect. They do not revisit creation. Even when material is removed, the core form remains untouched. The monument's authority survives alteration because it is not tied to surface details. It resides in continuity. Comparative evidence from Sumerian records provides a conceptual framework for understanding this posture. The kingship is defined as stewardship of inherited order. Systems of law, measurement, and ritual are described as older than rulers. Divine figures function as guarantors of continuity rather than agents of construction. Civilization is managed, not invented. Writing preserves procedure, not genesis. When these strands are brought together, the Great Pyramid begins to resemble an element within such a managed civilization. Its authority does not need to be argued because it is not grounded in human initiative. It functions as a received structure, one whose legitimacy derives from its placement within an inherited order rather than from a documented act of creation. This does not deny human labor or organization. It reframes their role. Human activity appears as execution within constraints, not as conceptual authorship. Builders, scribes, and kings operate as carriers of tradition. Their success is measured by fidelity to an existing framework. The pyramid becomes a test of alignment, not a showcase of originality. The distinction between inheritance and invention is therefore not technical but cultural. Invention would require explanation, justification, and narrative framing. Inheritance requires care, repetition, and silence. The evidence repeatedly favors the latter. The pyramid is managed like something that must be kept intact, not explained. Civilization treats it as a condition, not a claim. Such treatment has consequences for how history itself is written. If certain structures are placed beyond narration, they shape the archive without appearing in it. They become foundations upon which records are built, not entries within those records. Their past is absorbed into the present through use, rather than memory. The synthesis does not close the inquiry. It sharpens. Italiano. If the Great Pyramid functioned as an inherited structure within a civilization oriented toward preservation rather than innovation, then the absence of an origin story becomes meaningful rather than problematic. It reflects a worldview in which the most authoritative elements are those that precede explanation. This leaves a final uncertainty that cannot be resolved by evidence alone. If civilization, as recorded, begins after arrival, and if its greatest monument is treated as already complete, then what kind of past does such a system assume without naming? And if inheritance was the preferred framework through which order was understood, where does human history begin when its most defining structures were never meant to be explained at all? The inquiry reaches its limit not because evidence disappears, but because it becomes complete in a particular way. Texts, stones, measurements, and silences align to form a boundary. They allow certain questions to be asked clearly, repeatedly, and from multiple angles. They do not allow those questions to be answered conclusively. This boundary is not accidental. It is part of the record itself. The Great Pyramid stands at the center of this boundary. It is present in the administrative landscape, active in ritual language, precise in material form, and stable across time. Yet it never becomes an object of historical explanation within the culture that lived beside it. The archive does not argue about it. It does not justify it. It does not remember its beginning. Instead, it proceeds as if the monument belongs to a category of things that do not require narration. This posture defines the limits of inquiry. We can trace how the pyramid was used, maintained, aligned, measured, and revered. We can observe how later structures adapt themselves to it. We can compare its treatment with administrative and royal traditions that emphasize stewardship over invention. These lines of evidence suggest coherence. They suggest that the monument functioned as an inherited structure within a civilization oriented toward preservation. But they do not permit us to step beyond suggestion. The records consistently refuse to answer the question of origin, not by contradiction, but by origin does not appear as a problem the archive is designed to solve. Writing begins after arrival. It organizes what exists. It regulates continuity. It does not reconstruct beginnings. The pyramid's past, whatever it may have been, lies outside the scope of what the texts were meant to carry forward. Stone reinforces this restraint. The monument's physical behavior does not narrate process. It does not expose experimentation or conceptual struggle. It presents a finished logic. Yet stone, like text, does not speak of its own beginnings. It shows outcome without commentary. Material precision becomes evidence of execution, not of authorship. Measurement systems, orientation, and craft traditions deepen the same ambiguity. They appear complete when they enter the record. They function reliably without explanation. They suggest inheritance without specifying source. They support the possibility that the pyramid belongs to a received framework, but they do not require that conclusion. They simply make it reasonable. At this point, the investigation encounters a choice imposed by the evidence itself. One can insist on filling the silence with speculation, treating absence as loss, or one can accept silence as structure, treating omission as a feature of how early civilizations managed authority. The second approach does not resolve the mystery. It defines its shape. What the records allow us to ask, then, is limited but precise. They allow us to ask whether Egyptian civilization understood itself as beginning with invention or with stewardship. They allow us to ask whether its most powerful monument functioned as a claim of authorship or as a condition of legitimacy. They allow us to ask whether writing was meant to remember origins or to stabilize what had already arrived. What they do not allow is a final statement about how the pyramid was first conceived or constructed. That information lies beyond the archive's horizon, not because it was erased, but because it was never required. The civilization did not ground its authority in that knowledge. It grounded it in continuity. This does not mean the question of inheritance is answered. It means it is framed. The Great Pyramid can be understood as inherited without asserting how that inheritance occurred. The evidence supports the function of inheritance without describing its mechanism. It permits a posture of inquiry rather than a conclusion. Such restraint is itself instructive. It suggests that some aspects of early civilization were designed to remain beyond narration. They were meant to be lived with, not explained. The pyramid may belong to that category. Its authority persists precisely because it resists reduction to a story. In this light, the central question remains intact. Not resolved, but clarified. What if the Great Pyramid was inherited, not built, by the Egyptians? The records neither confirm nor deny this possibility. They make room for it by refusing to speak where invention would have been expected. The investigation ends where the archive begins, at the point where management replaces memory and function replaces origin. Beyond that point, inference gives way to respect for limits. And within those limits, one question remains quietly suspended, not as a challenge to history, but as a reflection of how early civilizations may have understood their own beginnings. By choosing not to ask where their most enduring structures came from at all.